You saw Junior Khumalo's live report about the conference being held by the Public Affairs Research Institute and KSAC, at which speakers have pointed out that less than one-third of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, the Commission to State Capture, have actually been implemented. Also, speakers from the head of the investigative directorate at the NPA saying that they just don't have the capacity to actually prosecute some of these cases. Devi Pillay is a researcher in the State Reform Programme at Parry, one of the hosts of this conference. Devi, good afternoon to you. We've had public promise after public promise that these recommendations will be implemented. Now, senior people from the NPA say they can't prosecute everybody. How do you assess this?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It's a very tricky thing. I mean, we've got a very long list of recommendations coming out of the Zondo Commission. A majority of those do concern individual investigations and prosecutions. But we must remember that these criminal justice institutions that are responsible for those investigations and prosecutions were themselves victims of state capture and are still suffering from a lot of the institutional decapacitation. So when they speak to us about these capacity constraints that they're facing, we really need to listen, and we need to look at how those budgets are allocated. We need to look at how people are appointed. We need to look at how resources are distributed and consider where government is really putting their priorities.
Well, I mean, we spend a lot of money on the VIP protection unit. One would think that maybe that money would be better spent for most of us if it actually went to the NPA.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of those cases where, I mean, even if you look at the difference in budget and resourcing between the SAPs and the NPA, for example, you can see a vast difference there. And what the NPA is telling us is not that it's a simple monetary constraint, but that they are really lacking skills and expertise for things like digital forensics. And these are things that the government should be taking seriously and should be implementing a plan to acquire these skills very quickly, but we haven't seen this happening.
Devi, is it also about political will?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing it always comes down to. We have to look at the political incentives and disincentives for everything that's taking place here. We also had a session about Parliament this morning, for example, where Zondo found that, a lot of this can be attributed to just the inaction and the dysfunctionality of oversight happening in Parliament. And it comes down to the political culture and political environment in which we're operating. There's only so much you can do when the people who occupy senior positions in the executive, are not implementing those recommendations and are not taking them forward. So we really need to identify points of pressure where civil society can advocate for a few clear reforms to really put their weight behind.
There are other things to this. I mean, if you were someone against whom testimony was led at the Zondo Commission and findings were made against you, and you haven't been charged with corruption, and now you have a senior person from the NPA saying you probably won't be charged with corruption, there probably won't be an investigation. Well, Devi, I don't know what would stop me being corrupt again.
Well, certainly. I mean, this is a huge problem with the idea of how do we deter people from undertaking similar crimes. And we really do need to see convictions happening. So when the NPA is coming out and saying that they are lacking capacity and that they are lacking institutional support, I think it really is a cry for help. And I think it is something that we all need to be taking seriously. But more than that, there are lots of reforms that government could be putting into place to stop a lot of these things from happening within the institutions, whether it's more regulation in the private sector, whether it's appointments reform, procurement reform, that can kind of interrupt these patterns that were identified by the Zondo Commission. So simply looking at the end game of convictions and prosecutions isn't enough, because that's only happening at the end of the chain when crimes have already been committed. So we need to do both.
Devi, do you have any hope that anything will change at all? I mean, it would seem, frankly, at the moment, unlikely.
Well, I will say we have been engaged a lot with a whole lot of legislation that's been coming through Parliament in the last couple of weeks on everything from public service and administration reform to procurement reform. Now the NPA bill is in Parliament. A lot of these pieces of legislation have some very, very promising and very important contents that I think could make a big difference going forward. Of course, there is also lots of flaws in these bills as well. So we hope the public participation process will really help turn these into meaningful reforms that will help our institutions and our anti-corruption architecture going forward. So there is movement in certain sectors of the state. Just hope that this can be transformed into sort of meaningful action going forward and isn't stymied by the same, political disincentives that we were just talking about.
Devi Pillay, thank you, researcher in the State Reform Programme at the Public Affairs Research Institute. Do appreciate the time. Well, we understand